welcome back to Plato's Cave. With me today, I have Sukaina Hirji from the University of Pennsylvania. She's a philosopher who is specializing in ethics and ancient philosophy, and I've invited her on the podcast to discuss a very recent paper, Outrage and the Bounds of Empathy. So thanks so much for joining me today.
Yeah, thanks for having me.
So like I was just remarking, I recently read your paper, which was published in October of 2022. Is that right?
Yeah, I think so. Yeah.
Okay. Super recent as far as like philosophy
Yeah,
papers
for
go.
sure.
Yeah. It's very rare that like I get to read a paper that was published within the past year, that like the
Right.
author might remember something about.
I mean,
Like
we'll see how much I remember, but
it's true. I mean, I send out invitations all the time, and I'm thinking like, oh, this was like 2017 or whatever. It's like
right.
super recent, and the people will email back like, I'm sorry, I would love to talk, but I have no recollection of what I wrote in that paper.
Well, and I mean, I'm sure you know this, but the sort of from the time when you start a paper or even finish the paper to when it actually comes out in print, there's usually such a lag time. So yeah.
And by the time like it finally gets published, you're so sick of like even looking at it that you can't bear
No,
to think about
true.
it.
And I also have a bad memory, so I often have the experience where I have to actually reread the paper just to remind myself what I was even doing.
Yeah. Yeah, well, don't worry, because I reread the paper just last
Perfect.
night. So
One of us remembers, yeah.
maybe I can tell you what you're up to if you forget.
Great.
I wanted, before we talk about like the paper in general, we
Yeah.
were chatting how this is kind of not like a recently burgeoning area of philosophy, but it
Yeah.
seems like a lot of kind of people are diving into this. What I was curious, like what made you interested in anger as like a philosophical topic?
Yeah, I mean, it's a really good question. I think there are a bunch of things, and maybe some of this is sort of like reflective of the more general interest. I mean, some of it is personal. Like, I just am somebody who's very prone to anger.
Same.
And it's, yeah, and it's something that, I think I have complicated feelings about because I think on the one hand, it really serves me in a lot of ways. I think on the other hand, it's really not always helpful. And a lot of that sort of tension is kind of what I'm working through in the paper. It's just the ways that I think anger can be both really valuable and at the same time damaging or destructive in certain ways. And so I think there's that. But then I also think there's sort of like more broadly sort of a cultural moment where you're seeing a lot of kind of collective public expressions of anger in political contexts. So, I think the Me Too movement, I think during the pandemic, like the shooting of George Floyd and sort of like protests around that. I also think just the sort of like more general discourse around kind of cancel culture on social media. I think all of that has sort of like brought some of the kind of like roles of anger and kind of public civil discourse like to the surface in a way that I think has just maybe reinvigorated a bit like our attention towards it.
Hmm. Hmm. Yeah, and it's I mean, that sounds, all very plausible to me. And also like for myself on a personal level, it's it has to be like one of the most common negative emotions that I feel.
Yeah.
And so
Yeah.
I mean, I remember, like I mentioned I read this in a seminar last semester, and I was just like loving every paper because I was like, okay,
Yeah.
I've got to figure this out for myself.
Yeah.
It's like
Yeah. Yeah.
because I don't have anything resembling like a structured relationship to anger. So, you know what I
Yeah.
mean? So like it's such a live issue.
Yeah, and I really feel I mean, I really, I think I use a lot of my work as like therapy. Like I really
Yeah.
believe the sort of like therapeutic role of philosophy. And so, yeah, I think, I find that like writing a paper about something is often like the most helpful thing for me, just working through my own relationship to
Mhm.
it.
Mhm. Yeah, no, totally. Like I'll figure out what I actually think about something when I'm figuring out the outline or actually writing it or
Yeah.
whatever. I'm like, oh, you know what? That sounds right to me.
Yeah. Yeah, exactly.
Yeah. No, I'm looking forward to discussing the paper because it you draw on a lot of like recent examples from the news, a lot of like
Yeah.
recent sort of just interpersonal examples, and it made me think of a ton of just past experiences that I've had too.
Oh, cool.
Uh,
Yeah. No,
mhm.
I'm glad to hear that.
Yeah, no, it was a very and I liked the kind of style of writing it. It it didn't commit that philosophical crime of being interesting but unreadable. So,
Yeah.
so, so,
No, I'm glad. Yeah, I do try to write papers that people can read.
Yes. No, I've noticed that recent papers do such a better job than past ones. I mean, even as
Yeah,
early as like, I won't say the name because I don't need to say the name of the
yeah,
paper, but it
yeah,
was like 2003 and it was literally
yeah,
unreadable. You know,
yeah, yeah, yeah. I mean, I do. Yeah, I've sort of enjoyed seeing the ways that the field has changed in the last decade or so. Like, I think partly there's sort of just more interest in kind of social issues brought, like the social world broadly construed. But then I think, yeah, there's sort of a bit more openness to like different styles and ways of sort of developing an argument. And that has felt really nice to me because I think
Hmm.
like when I was in grad school, I remember there was this kind of like way that a lot of people were writing papers where, you would name a view and then, you'd have all this sort of like technical machinery and, not that there's anything wrong with that sort of style, but I think it's nice to see that there's just sort of like different models now.
Hmm. Yeah, I totally agree. So actually, I had my first question is about the
Yeah, yeah.
second sentence in the paper.
Yeah,
So
which you'll remind me of.
yes, which I'll read you the first two sentences. So you begin the paper by saying, often when we are angry at someone who has hurt us. Our anger is a protest against a perceived mistreatment, and its function is to hold the person accountable for their offense. So I mean, I think that I was interpreting this right, but when you say that like often our anger is a protest against the perceived mistreatment, I take it that like insofar as we're talking about anger as primarily an internal emotion and not an expression of anything, the protest is also sort of like this internal reaction
Right.
against the mistreatment.
Yeah.
Okay.
Yeah.
Okay.
Yeah, I mean, I think that's a really nice sort of question because people do distinguish between sort of like feeling an emotion and expressing an emotion, and then there's a question of like, is the function, in the case of like resentment, if we think about it as a kind of protest, is that only when it's expressed, or is it also
Hmm.
the sort of feeling? And I think it depends a little bit on what you think the protest is. So if you think like what part of what the protest is just a protest within yourself about sort
Hmm.
of like sort of expression of self-respect or standing up for yourself or like recognizing for yourself that you've been mistreated, then I think that even without the expression there is that. If you think of resentment more as a kind of sanctioning behavior where you're sort of like it has to do with the offender, then of course like the expression is going to matter.
Hmm. Hmm. And I mean, at least this seems true for me. It seems like oftentimes when I'm genuinely feeling an emotion, at least maybe to a certain degree,
Yeah.
it is going to be like very intrinsically leaky into
Yeah,
the
sure.
real world.
No, I mean, I think we all know that feeling where like you're upset with somebody and you don't want to like make it their problem or talk to them about it, but then they're like, "Why are you acting all weird?"
Yeah, yeah, yeah. Or you just have to kind of like get away from them or something, and then even that is
Exactly.
like a
Yeah.
manifestation. Yeah,
Yeah.
totally, totally. Yeah, so I guess maybe I'll just say at the top what I take some of your like main goals in the paper to be.
Sure. Yeah.
Cool. Okay, because it seems like there are four main ones. So you want to develop an account of outrage anger and contrast it with other kinds of anger, which I thought was really interesting. And then show the benefits of outrage anger, especially in certain contexts, but highlight that it comes with these really kind of unshakable epistemic and prudential costs, and then kind of conclude with broad theorizing about when it might be more wise to adopt this.
Yeah.
Yeah, yeah. Which I liked. There was no chaff in the paper. Like it was it was you weren't like wading into some whatever and like adding 3 or 4 extra pages. So it was very
Yeah. Yeah.
the
I'm glad
pages
you
were
feel that way.
worthwhile. Yes.
Yeah, I mean, it's funny because it's a paper where I was just trying to think through again, like my own sort of relationship to
Hmm.
anger. And I was really thinking about these sort of like, cancel culture kind of moments where, you think like screw all men or screw all white people or like whatever it is. And, sort of thinking about like in my own relationships, in my sort of like friend groups, my community is just like the ways that people sort of use anger and sort of martial anger collectively in these contexts. And so, yeah, in a way, the paper, it's not the kind of paper in moral philosophy where my goal is to like come up with a prescription. I'm not sort of like trying to
Hmm.
argue like we ought to X or we ought not to Y. And so, in some ways, like, I really appreciate your sort of characterization of what I'm doing because in some ways, like, I just exploring, I'm just sort of like asking a question, and I do sort of try to like develop a kind of some conceptual resources around anger, but ultimately I'm really just exploring this kind of like ambivalent nature of this kind of anger, and that sort of bringing out that sort of ambivalence is much more important to me than coming up with any kind of like clear prescriptions about when and how we should feel outrage.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, that really tracks my like journey through the anger seminar, where
Yeah.
at first, like I came
Yeah.
in like trying to just, the wheels of like justification started
Yeah.
off, where I'm like, oh, I'm
Totally.
angry all the time, so it must be
Yeah.
right. So I was like looking
Yeah.
for all these ways to defend it. And then
Yeah.
like, you read like Nussbaum and Seneca, and you're like,
Yeah.
and Pettigrove, and I'm like, oh, this is a
Sure.
pretty dumb emotion. You know what I mean? I should
Yeah.
try to get rid of it. But then you think about it and it's like, well, no, it kind of works well in a lot of these contexts. And
Yeah.
then, but it's hard to define like in any sort of systematic way.
Yeah.
So you know what I mean? Like I kind of like ended up with, yeah, like you said, like a lot of ambivalence about like, well, it just, I don't know, it seems like more wise at certain times and more unwise at other times. And I don't really know that I can do any better than that.
Yeah, I mean, I think that's right. It's just something, it's kind of true of a lot of my work right now is that I'm really interested in these kind of like ambivalent responses that we have towards things and what they kind of tell us about the world. And, I just more and more sort of like am inclined to think that there's like real philosophical progress in just describing that kind of ambivalence or tension, and sort of like noticing that in a lot of these cases are just kind of competing reasons, and there's not going to be some clear determinate answer, or at least not like a universal one.
Hmm. Hmm. Yeah, totally. I mean that maybe I'll just table it for now. But like
Yeah.
I'm really interested in your thoughts about the intrinsic versus instrumental reasons debate
Yeah.
around anger. But maybe I'll flag that, because I think maybe it's better to get some like things on the table first before
Sure. Yeah.
talking
Yeah.
about it.
Yeah.
Cool. Um, so well, I guess a question for you, because there's kind of like the case of Janelle Miller is central in the paper.
Yeah. Yeah.
Do you want, and a lot of like the quotes I have of you discussing different types of anger will use that case. Do you want to
Yeah.
give like a brief synopsis of it, and then I can ask a question?
Yeah, sure. I mean, I've noticed in a lot of my work recently, I'm really drawn towards using kind of like real life cases, because I think it's really helpful to have an example when we do philosophy, but I also really find, for me, a lot of thought experiments tend to feel a little bit too thin. Like they don't feel like real world examples. They don't tend to have the kind of like, I mean, by design, they don't tend to kind of be quite as messy. And I also think sometimes it can feel a little bit, especially when you're talking about the social world, and especially when it comes to sort of like marginalized groups, it can feel a little bit sort of, I don't know, uncomfortable to kind of like be creating these thought experiments about cases of like oppression or domination. And so, yeah, I've really been drawn to real world examples, and I was looking for a kind of case of anger. And I had picked up her memoir because I had read her sort of like the sort of viral post that she did post trial. So the story, for those who don't know, is that she was actually like I'm gonna not even remember the details, but Chanel Miller was assaulted on the Stanford campus by a student at Stanford at the time, Brock Turner, and the case became quite famous because in the trial, Brock Turner was given a very lenient sentence by the judge, and the judge said a lot of things about how he didn't want to kind of ruin Brock Turner's life and his promising athletic career. And so it was a case where I think a lot of people felt like the judge felt a disproportionate amount of sympathy towards the offender, Brock Turner, as compared to the victim. And I think a lot of the sort of public discourse about it sort of like reflected the same kind of sympathy for Brock Turner. And so, yeah, it became a case that kind of like got a lot of media attention. And then Chanel Miller published a kind of anonymous, basically victim statement where she kind of described her experience at the trial. But then later she sort of like publicly identified the case with herself and wrote a memoir about it, where she kind of like fleshes out her experience during the trial and afterwards. So yeah.
Mm-hmm. And I guess for like the purposes of the paper, an important feature of the case was that, her being sort of sequestered in the trial setting for an extended period of time, and having that, she was kind of plucked from her normal moral community and like
Yeah.
dropped into this foreign one
Yeah.
where, yeah, her sort of I mean, I guess this is a good way to contrast outrage anger with reform anger,
Yeah.
which you do on page 3. I'll read you a quote. So you're suggesting that Miller's anger is not really directed towards the offending party, being Brock Turner, at all. Her anger is outrage anger, a kind of anger at the state of affairs in which the offense against her is unintelligible as the offense that it is. And I thought that, I mean, I really liked the way you put it there because, as you describe in the trial, it was this kind of what I have to imagine was like a surreal situation where it seemed like from what you describe and what you quote, like no one in the trial was really even debating like that the assault happened. They were more
Yeah.
of like almost debating whether it was wrong to a great degree or something like that.
Exactly. Yeah. And I think that's really important because, some of the cases of outrage anger that I'm interested in, where I'm sort of drawing from the feminist theorist Maria Lugones, are cases where there's kind of no uptake, right? So, like, take the example of like in the like Mad Men era, 1950s, if a woman was being harassed or assaulted at her job, it was the kind of thing where like, if you complain, you would be kind of like laughed off or dismissed because it wasn't considered a real wrong. It wasn't even sort of like, it wouldn't even register as something that like warranted resentment or being upset. Whereas I think things look a little bit different now. And it's actually, I think, part of what makes it harder to kind of identify cases where you have this sort of conditions under which outrage anger is appropriate. Because, yeah, in Chanel Miller's case, I think there's a sense in which nobody's denying, nobody's like pretending like or kind of gaslighting her into thinking like nothing bad happened to her or that she was asking for it. I think the everybody sort of feels bad. Everybody thinks like something very unfortunate happened to her. Everybody acknowledges that it was a case of assault. But what isn't happening in that kind of hermeneutical space that she's in is like, yeah, the recognition that it's a very serious wrong and that she was kind of very clearly the victim. So she wasn't sort of like an equal party or partly responsible for what happened to her. And so it's less about whether or not people are able to recognize it as a case of assault and more about just where the sort of like emotional energy is going in the case. Again, so much of it is going towards Brock Turner.
Yeah, and so you use that to kind of make like to mark this fundamental difference between I take it that reform anger is more of our default kind of type of anger.
Yeah.
And then oftentimes like when it's not received in the way that we want, we're almost pushed by the circumstances like into outrage anger.
I think that's right. I mean, and I don't want to sort of overgeneralize, but yeah, it does seem right to me that like in general, we sort of like immediately resort to reform anger, like in the sort of hope or expectation that it will be taken up. But then if we then come to learn that actually we're not in a space where we're going to get uptake, then I think, yeah, we sort of resort to this more extreme measure of outrage anger.
And so like or at least a fundamental difference is that reform anger is kind of what you refer to in Straussonian terms as like a reactive attitude. It is it's viewing the other person as kind of like a moral equal or an agential equal in the sense that, we're looking to have this like exchange of emotions that play appropriately off of each other. And it has this like actually, you put it well in another quote. So you say the object of reform anger is the person who has committed some moral violation, but its function is to hold the abuser accountable and to demand that the injustice be addressed. So it's like very, very kind of almost it's putting forth like a respect for the other person in a way. Like you're saying like we can have this exchange.
Yeah. And I think, I mean, this is something that I think a lot of the literature on, what I call reform anger does really nicely. So, Maisha Cherry's work, I think recently has kind of like made this point in a lot of different ways where, there's a kind of like love or respect that you're showing to a person by expressing anger towards them, by holding them accountable, by sort of like demanding better. Because what you're doing is saying like, I see that you're part of a moral community. I see that you're a sort of like morally responsible agent. And I believe that you have the capacity to kind of do better and kind of like reform your behavior.
And and when that doesn't land, then you're sort of pushed into this outrage anger, which it seems like, kind of as you characterize, as more of like a turn. It's kind of interesting because it seems like it has a turn inward, like
Yeah.
you're withdrawing, but it
Yeah.
also seems to have a turn outwards towards like a different moral community. Does
Yeah.
that seem right?
Yeah. I think so, yeah, because in a way you're sort of stepping out of the moral community that you find yourself in, and then, maybe hoping that you find something else outside of that moral community, right? So the idea is you kind of, I think on this sort of Strassonian framework, we're all sort of members of this moral community together. And, for Strawson, there's this sort of participant stance where we relate to each other as members, and then you can kind of also be seen or see other people in this kind of more objective stance. And the thought here is I'm kind of trying to sort of like add some stuff to that framework, where actually I think there are these cases where, like, instead of sort of like, somebody does something terrible and you kind of see them as no longer part of your moral community, it's actually you're the one who's kind of like stepping out of the moral community and looking sort of maybe optimistically for other people who share similar experiences.
And it seems like, I mean, I know Strawson says that we can kind of do this for like two different reasons. There's an abnormality in the circumstances, and then there's an abnormality with the person. Do you think outrage anger can be kind of brought on by both of those types of abnormalities as well?
I mean, honestly, I don't really see it as falling into the objective stance in that way. So I think this is a place where, like, I think Strawson just wasn't sort of thinking about these kinds of cases where, I don't think that, like, there's something abnormal about Brock Turner. I mean, actually, it seems like extremely normal for like a college-age man to assault a woman at a party when they're drunk on a college campus. Like, it's actually, in some ways incredibly normal behavior, unfortunately. And so, I don't think that it's like he's incapable of moral reasoning. I think he's young and stupid and raised in like a very bad sort of toxic culture. And I also, that's kind of important for the paper because I think, I'm not somebody who thinks like, oh, we should just treat him as though he's a monster. Like, I actually think he's probably a pretty typical male college student who, did a kind of horrific thing and didn't take accountability for it. But I think that's like hardly unusual. And so, this is important because, I'm actually writing a kind of follow-up paper to this paper now, where I actually think, in some ways about the like inverse kind of argument. So I'm thinking about cases where you should have empathy for people who've treated you very badly. So thinking about cases where you should have empathy because that empathy is going to help you get rid of your resentment towards them. And that's like a positive thing. And I'm thinking about cases of abuse, or like very serious mistreatment. And so all of that's to say, like, I think there's a reasonable stance to have on which, like, Brock Turner actually deserves empathy. He deserves sort of, like, support and love and care and the opportunity to kind of, like, reform his behavior. It just shouldn't come from Chanel Miller because that's at too high a cost to her. And so for her, if it serves her to sort of see him as though he's, not really, for her to not see him in the kind of participant stance, or for her to not see him as a member of her moral community, I think that's, important and valuable.
Yeah, I mean that's really interesting. It kind of makes me think of I think that Gary Watson says like that sense of there, but for the grace of God go I. Like we're all in some deep sense like really lucky not to have whatever it was, like bad formative circumstances or whatever it is. Yeah. That's really interesting. I was curious then if I was understanding. So like you said, you draw on the work of Maria Lugones a lot in the paper, and I wanted to tell you my interpretation of first order and second order anger and what the debate is, and then see what you thought of my. Yeah. Cool. Because this was in the seminar. This was like one of the main points of debate. It's like what is at stake between. Okay, cool. So
cool.
Okay, so I'll read a quote from you first. Just so people know what I'm talking about. So Lugones distinguishes between what she calls first order anger and second order anger. For her, first order anger is an anger that has a communicative intent and does or does not succeed in getting uptake within a particular world of sense, whereas second order anger presupposes worlds of sense against which the anger constitutes an indictment or a rebellion, worlds of sense from which one needs to separate. So I was thinking about like, okay, so in both of those contexts, what is at stake? And it seems like maybe the difference there is like in first order anger, both parties agree what's wrong or what would be wrong, but are disagreeing about what the facts are or sort of like what happened. In Nussbaum's terms, like the conversation is over whether anger is well grounded. But in when second order anger arises, everyone is, and this is kind of illustrated in the case of Chanel Miller, everyone agrees what happened, but the debate is over whether it's wrong.
Yeah.
Yeah.
I think that's right. Yeah. Yeah.
Okay, cool. And I honestly, like I read that. This was one of those like awesome moments when you're reading something and then you realize, oh wow, like this has been this like inchoate thing that I've recognized for years, but like never thought about it explicitly.
Oh, awesome. Yeah.
Yeah. Yeah.
No, I think it's a really, I think it's such a helpful distinction.
And I mean, I mean, already just reading that and like thinking of just past like experiences of mine.
Yeah.
There's like a particular fury that when you are forced into like this second order anger, that like evokes in me because there's almost a sense in which like you can find a sense of peace with, okay, well, like we both agree that if I did lie to you, that would have been wrong. But like we're just debating over whether what I said was a lie. You know what I mean? Like that's at least a reasonable disagreement. But when you and I both agree on exactly what happened, and you're just like, you know what? I don't think that, like I don't think that was wrong. And I'm like,
exactly. Yeah. No, exactly. And I think, I mean, there's a special kind of fury, I think, because you're sort of being treated as though your emotions are kind of unintelligible, right? Like, and you see this a lot in cases of abuse where the person's kind of like, I don't know what you're talking about. You're kind of overreacting, or that's not an appropriate response to what's happening, or something where it's not like I didn't mean to hurt you, or like you misheard. It's just a very different kind of I think discussion and sort of like treating you as though the emotions that you're having are just kind of like completely off base.
And it's just it's also like so when the conversation gets to that point, it's so disheartening because you're losing sight of the success conditions of like the disagreement. Like at least we can figure out, well, this rarely happens, but like you can figure out like whether or not something was well grounded. But like if you're like inhabiting separate moral communities, like there's not a lot of room for resolution there.
Yeah, I think that's right. And I think also, again, it can be sort of damaging to how you see yourself, your own kind of self-conception, if you're trying to convince somebody, if the argument you're having is like trying to convince somebody else that you deserve like care and respect, that could actually be really damaging to you to have to sort of be in a position of being on the defense about something like that.
Yeah. Like there's like a fundamental way in which like this shouldn't be part of the debate. That makes sense. So when you refer to Lugones' use of worlds of sense, I interpreted that this was another thing we were debating in the seminar. I interpreted worlds of sense as sort of like worlds of value, or maybe specifically like values relevant to that disagreement. I didn't know how you were interpreting the worlds of sense.
Yeah, I mean, it's a really good question. And, like I'm not a Lugones scholar. And I also, there's a sort of tricky translation that happens when you're sort of reading work that's not in the analytic tradition, and then you're sort of trying to translate it into the analytic tradition. And so I don't take a sort of like very clear stand about this. I think I use the idea of like a kind of hermeneutical space where I have in mind something like the thing you're describing, of just like set of sort of beliefs, ideologies, assumptions, values, all that kind of stuff that just sort of shapes how we interpret the world around us.
Hmm.
And that can include all kinds of things, including, what we think matters, or,
Okay, so that makes me wonder if the kind of like dominant world of sense uh, can that so I think all of your examples involved one person in a larger group of people. But I was wondering if the dominant world of sense could also, it doesn't have to be sort of like a numbers difference. It could be a
yeah,
difference in other ways too. So like in a relationship, maybe if like
yeah,
one person kind of holds more of the cards or something,
definitely, yeah.
yeah, then the dominant world of sense can actually be located in just one other person.
Yeah, I think so. I mean, it's like in this paper, I don't really think about the case of just like one-on-one sort of intimate relationships.
Hmm.
But yeah, I think, um, so yeah, I'm interested in kind of like, thinking about sort of like more political kind of context where there's kind of dominant group and a sort of less dominant group. But yeah, you can imagine, I think, the same dynamics playing out even in
Hmm.
like a one-on-one relationship where there's just like power dynamics in place. Because it's
Hmm.
the phenomenon I'm describing of outrage anger, I think, is like something that people do experience like one-on-one as well. But I think there are often these kind of like background social forces at play.
Hmm. Hmm. Yeah, yeah, that totally makes sense. And also, I mean, I can imagine like a circumstance where you are in a, a larger group, but then having like a conversation with one member of that group or something, and
Yeah,
they're like they would be inheriting almost like the power of the group in that situation. So you would
I
still
think
be,
so.
yeah.
I mean, I think you see that a lot. Yeah.
Hmm, hmm. Yeah, that makes sense. And it seems like so okay, so then experiencing outrage, anger in those contexts is sort of it involves this like withdrawal
Yeah.
from the aim of even sort of like, I mean, the way I read it is like you're when you turn inwards, like you're giving up on the aim of um reactively exchanging with these people. Like you have
Yeah.
to pull back
Yeah.
because you're realizing like this anger like doesn't just it doesn't has no uptake. Um
Yeah.
yeah, and then when
No,
you
yeah, I
oh
agree.
yeah, no,
Yeah.
go ahead, I'm sorry.
Go ahead. No, 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 please. Yeah.
So that's the turn inward. And then it seems like there's also, and I wonder if this is a constitutive part of outrage anger for you, or if it's like a correlate, um, that you also have this sort of like turn inwards, but then this turn, I don't know, like backwards or outwards or something, like calling out to what you hope is a shared world of sense.
Yeah.
Mhm.
Yeah, I mean, I think, I don't think of outrage anger as like particularly constructive, but I do think that's the effect often, right, of like kind of
Okay.
expressing
Okay.
this sort of outrage anger is that it's recognized by other people in kind of similar spaces. And, if you think about sort of like consciousness raising circles in the past, or even, now you see this in sort of like collective expressions of anger on social media, like the Me Too movement. I think, in a way, the Me Too movement was just a sort of like group expression of outraged anger. And it's sort of like it built momentum, and it built sort of like
Mm,
attention, grew because I think like sort of women heard the outrage of other women and kind of like felt seen and heard, and then,
mm,
wanted to kind of express it back.
mhm. Yeah, I mean, that makes me wonder. Like reform anger has this really clear. It, I'm wondering if reform anger has more of a cognitive element baked into it than outrage anger does,
Yeah.
where like reform anger explicitly, even the experience of it,
Yeah.
seems to have um almost like an aim to it, whereas
Yeah.
outrage anger seems to be a little bit more of the impulse, like okay, this is like messed up, like kind
Yeah.
of like the burn it down impulse almost.
Yeah. I mean, I think that's right, and it's not something I really talk about in the paper, but if you think about outrage anger as, the reform anger is sort of like working within the sort of
Mm,
existing moral community, and there's sort of like rules in place, right? So like we have a sort of idea of like and like this is on this sort of Straussonian framework, but like if you think like there are certain actions and behavior. So if you think, our relationships with each other are constituted by a set of sort of like obligations and expectations and whatever, and then there's sort of like kind of clear rules or norms or, scripts for like when you kind of violated your obligations or duties towards a person. And then there's sort of like, often like recourse, right? There's sort of like expectations about what repair looks like. I think so we have these kind of like established norms within a moral community that I think reform anger is often sort of like appealing to in various ways. And, whether that's because it's more sort of intrinsically cognitive or whether it's just because there's like more stuff out there that you can kind of latch on to, I think that is right. Whereas I think, outrage anger kind of has this sort of world building quality, right? It's sort of like you're trying to like create something new, like a different kind of moral community. And so I think that there's less kind of like machinery in place to appeal to.
Yeah, no, that tracks with my experience as well. I think that makes a lot of sense. So okay, this was another thing that I was really curious about, this kind of the conversation between, so you kind of find yourself in this moral community that is completely alien to you, and I mean, it seems like you kind of have several ways to go. You can dive into and fully embrace like this outrage anger, or you can adopt more of like kind of a cold objective attitude. And I was curious, I mean, so you say that like one of the main upsides of outrage anger specifically is that it really does kind of like close off your empathy towards the other person. And and you quote, there's this really, I loved the way that Bailey phrases it. The quote is that central to empathy is the ability to imaginatively take up another person's perspective, to feel their reasons as reasons, which I thought was a really helpful way of putting it. Yeah. So I completely see how, and maybe you can just explain this for people. So how does outrage anger kind of shut down that sense of empathy when you adopt it towards someone?
Yeah, I mean, I don't say much about the mechanism because honestly, that's just not what I like really know anything about. But the thought is just, I mean, and I think this is, something where there's a fair bit of empirical evidence. The thought is just when we feel resentment or anger or outrage, like there's actually not a lot of space to also at the same time feel empathy, and I think vice versa. So the way I tend to think about like empathy and anger is they're kind of like filters that we can put on where we sort of see the same set of information but like in a kind of different light. So we're sort of like taking in certain things but not seeing other things as clearly, where it's kind of like where we're focusing our attention. And so I think, empathy focuses our attention on, a lot of stuff about the other person, right? Like seeing their actions and behaviors as making sense to them, and then so in some ways making sense to us as well. Whereas anger is sort of like, to me, a kind of refusal to like really let that information in. So to really think about like why Brock Turner might have acted the ways he did, what are the social forces that kind of like made him think that it was acceptable or okay. You're just kind of like, I'm not trying to take in any of that information. Yeah.
I mean, that's I was thinking about this because like I was imagining or just thinking about like my own kind of situations in which like especially with, so my extended family is like very, very socially conservative and evangelical Christians, like the kind of like homosexuality is wrong kind of Christians. And so like going like, especially like in high school and stuff, going to those family events was like this situation where like there was just, I had zero chance of any uptake like on, you know what I mean, on these issues. And so it seems like, I mean, I feel like early on I would adopt this really kind of sense of like outrage anger, and just kind of be thinking to myself, like, this is fucked up. Like, this is like, what, like, why can't, they see that this is just like a completely insane worldview to have. But there was a notable cost there that I don't know if you address, and I'm curious what you think about that. It maybe this is more of like a confession than anything else, but it was hard for me to keep outrage, anger up and humming internally, but not
Yeah.
have that bleed out into kind of my external behavior. Whereas the adoption of something more akin to like an objective attitude, just like a cold,
Yeah.
almost like turning off of reactivity, really allowed me to sort of like get through those situations like with much more grace.
Yeah, interesting. Yeah, so I mean, I take it the question is like, outrage might be one way to kind of like block your ability to sort of like engage or feel empathy, but like maybe just like shutting down, like maybe just like a sort of like different kind of like distance or refusal is like a better mechanism. Is that what you're thinking?
Yeah, and I don't know if it's like I
Sorry,
don't
there's a
know
lot
that
of dog activity in the
it's
background.
all good. What kind are they?
So there's my dog, and she has a friend visiting, and
Oh,
so
that's
she's
cute.
a husky lab mix, and then the other dog is like I think a Grand Pyrenees. He's a rescue, so
Oh,
yeah,
oh, they're very
they really
cute.
love each other. But of course, anytime you're on Zoom, they decide it's time to play.
No worries. No worries. Um, what was I? Oh,
Yeah.
yeah, yeah. Oh, I don't know that I would like make the claim that one is like somehow better, but maybe like in some circumstances one is like more wise to adopt
Yeah,
or something like that.
yeah. I mean, I
Yeah.
guess again, like maybe I would sort of question, so think about the distinction between like feeling and expressions of anger,
Hmm.
and then also just like the different ways that anger can look. Because I kind of wonder if like the thing you're feeling isn't a version of outrage, it's just one that's causing you to sort of like pull away and feel distance or withdraw, as opposed to sort of like, because the problem is, right, like if you're in that sort of environment and you express outrage in a different kind of way, like
Hmm.
it is going to feel like engagement, right? It's actually going to be read as reform anger, right? It's going to be read as like you want to have an argument or a conversation, and that's actually what you're exactly trying to avoid, right? Is that you're actually going to like separate yourself from the kind of like world in which this conversation makes sense. So, I don't know, and again, yeah, I feel the worry of like, does it really make sense to call the thing that's happening with you outrage in those cases when it really seems more like a kind of strategic withdrawal? But yeah, I wonder whether actually it is a way of kind of feeling outrage and expressing it in a way that's actually allowing you to step away. And then it's the
Yeah.
kind of thing where like you might actually express that outrage differently in a different space, right? Like you might sort of then like talk to your close friends and be like, I
Yes.
can't believe that. Yeah.
That's exactly how it works.
Yeah.
Exactly how it
Yeah.
works. Yeah. Yeah. And
Because again,
then
it's like Chanel Miller isn't, when she's expressing anger, she's not doing it at Brock Turner. And I think that's like the kind of,
yes.
yeah.
Yeah, totally. Yeah. Yeah, I mean that was I because there's it's I think you quoting other people I can't find it in the paper, but there's this idea that like almost intrinsically to take this even like objective empathizing with
Yeah.
someone else is this like almost invitation to lose your outrage even like at the situation or that the situation is happening because you sort of like see them as whatever it may be, like a mere byproduct of something, or if you see their reasons like as reasons, then it naturally like diminishes anger. And um maybe it naturally my thought was like maybe it naturally diminishes anger, but I don't know that it naturally diminishes your I don't want to phrase it like your ability to hang on to the values that you have.
Yeah.
It seems like it might depend on what we say. The quote was uh, from Bailey, like seeing their reasons as reasons. And
Yeah.
I wonder if it might turn on like what we mean by that, because if you see their reasons as the reasons that were relevant to them,
Yeah.
then I don't know that it does really necessitate like a loss of your own values. Yeah.
No, I think that's right. And, this gets to like, the paper that I'm working on now where I'm really interested in sort of literature on forgiveness, where there's this kind of like classic puzzle about forgiveness, which is like, if you had good reasons to be angry in the first place and nothing undermines or changes those reasons, then like, why would you ever forgive a person? And, you know, there's different strategies that people take. And the strategy that I sort of suggest is that actually feeling empathy towards a person and seeing their reasons as reasons kind of puts you in a different stance in relation to the person. So you're still in the sort of participant stance, but you're no longer in this kind of retributive stance where you're evaluating a person's actions with respect to whether they treated you in the ways that they owed you. You're actually evaluating their actions and behaviors in terms of something else. And I call it like the relational stance, which is the stance where you're thinking about whether you want to continue to be in a sort of relationship of shared vulnerability with the person. And that's important because, yeah, I think you're right that, like, you know, in principle, it should be possible for you to feel empathy towards a person, see their reasons as reasons, not have that sort of like change or revise or undermine any of the reasons that supported your resentment. But for you to kind of be able to hold both things. I think what's going on in the kind of outrage cases that I'm interested in is because of the sort of background conditions where there's this sort of overwhelming pressure on, say, a victim of sexual assault to kind of defer to the experience and concern for the offender, that it's like really hard to hold the sort of seeing their reasons as reasons alongside the seeing them as having reasons to hold on or to, you know, to feel like they deserved better treatment, because the background context is one that's kind of overwhelmingly pushing them in the direction of only caring about the offender. And so I think when you are in a situation where those background conditions are different, so I think about, in this other paper, I think about the case of like parental abuse, so a parent abusing their child, but in a situation where, you know, it's a parent from a kind of marginalized background and like they're experiencing a lot of kind of financial stress and racism and all kind of stuff. And so you can kind of understand why a parent under these like extreme stressors might actually not be able to treat their child in the ways that they deserve. And I think you can also understand why a child in that situation might really want a relationship with their parent despite all of that, because they're both from these marginalized communities. They actually really need like familial relationships, you know, to sort of like survive in the world. And so, yeah, I think just thinking about different background conditions, I think actually really changes how we think about the interaction of empathy and anger.
Yeah, totally. So maybe we'll wrap up on this question, because I mean, like your paper in a way like blurred even more for me this debate over like intrinsic versus instrumental reasons, and not blurred in a bad way, but like it's just it highlights how like messy like, you know, just inherently it is. So basically, I mean, for people who might not know, like instrumental reasons to have a certain reaction, emotional reaction, are reasons like in virtue of other consequences, good or bad. And then if something is an intrinsic reason to have an emotional reaction, it's just because it's fitting to what is actually what it's responding to. And I am so, that's like the thing that I'm kind of still trying to work out from the class. Like that conversation is one that seems really almost intractable to me. And I was curious, like how, you know, in this work and then further work, like you're viewing those concerns around emotional reactions.
Yeah. So what is the concern exactly? Like, where do you feel like?
Yeah. Okay. So the concern is like how to weigh the two types of reasons. So, so I like one kind of paper that I've been working on is investigating whether actually Chris Franklin and Amia Srinivasan, if you read her in a certain light, the aptness of anger paper, can be like read at least to be providing this like argument that anger is the only fitting reaction to injustice, and I'm not sure about that. And so like I argue that a combination of grief and disappointment can do all of the intrinsic work. Now it may be instrumentally better, you know, for in different circumstances or whatever, but my worry is like, okay, well, anger clearly like does have this intrinsic value, but if it's not the only emotional reaction that can do that intrinsic work, then I wonder if that kind of pushes us back into trying to think about things in like, it feels really cold and like robotic to think about things in terms of consequences, but maybe like this just this sense of like, what is it wise to do in certain situations? Yeah.
Yeah, I mean, I'm sympathetic to this, and actually, I sort of okay. So my take is right. Like when we think about emotions, we sort of think about the kind of aptness conditions, which are typically in terms of like what the emotion is appraising or evaluating about the world, and then we think about the sort of action tendency, like what does the emotion sort of like get us to do in the world. And I think this sort of important, and so, because there are these kind of aptness conditions for emotions, we can think of emotions as like rational or irrational. So like, if you're like afraid of like a rubber snake, like that's a case where like your fear is kind of appraising this as a dangerous situation, but in this case your fear is like not appraising it correctly, and so we can say like that's actually an irrational emotional response. And if you're somebody who has a phobia of like rubber snake, because I have a friend who's like terrified of snakes, and so like even seeing just like a picture of a snake, just like she gets like she freaks out. And so that's a case where like you might want to take steps to like get rid of that emotion because it's not rational. But I think even in the case of emotions where they're rational, right? So where they're apt or fitting responses or sort of correctly evaluating the world, I actually think that we are not compelled to feel them. And I think actually on some level we kind of know this about emotions. Like this is the way that emotions I think are different from beliefs. Is like if we're presented with a bunch of evidence about something, we're sort of rationally compelled to believe it. Whereas in the case of emotions, I think if there's a good reasons to feel a particular emotion, we're not compelled, I think, to feel that emotion. It's rationally fitting, permissible, acceptable, appropriate to feel the emotion, but that doesn't take us all the way towards it being compulsory. And that's actually, I think, important in cases like the cases I'm interested in with empathy and anger, because I think there are cases where, so, in the paper I'm working on now, I think, I'm interested in cases where it's appropriate to feel resentment. It's also appropriate to feel empathy, but you're not really going to be able to feel both at the same time, because you feel empathy is going to crowd out the resentment. If you feel the resentment, it's going to crowd out the empathy. And I actually think these are cases where it's rationally permissible for us to decide which of the things is more important to us. And as you're saying, like, I think there are cases where resentment is not going to serve us because we might want to have a relationship with the person and resentment is not going to get us there. We might want to sort of restore trust and comfort and safety and all those kinds of things. But then likewise, I think in the case of Chanel Miller, like she has good reasons to feel outraged. And so she shouldn't be listening to the people who tell her like, here are all the sort of like therapeutic tools that will help you get rid of your anger, because it actually might be the best thing for her. And so, yeah, I mean, I think, and so, what you're sort of pointing out is like, sometimes there are these kind of instrumental reasons to maybe question whether, even if the emotion is fitting or appropriate, whether we should take steps to kind of get rid of it or focus our attention on other stuff and cultivate other emotions.
Yeah, especially if there's nothing intrinsically lost with responding in other emotional ways. Well, okay, we're coming up on an hour, so I want to let you go. But I really, really enjoyed the conversation. Thank you so much.
Yeah, no, it was my pleasure. Thank you so much. And yeah, I mean, it's it's such an honor and pleasure to have someone read my work. So thank you.
Yeah, of course. So this paper is on. It was published in Philosopher's Imprint, which is completely open access, right? So anyone can get this. Exactly. Okay.
Yep.
Cool. Yeah. Well, it's extremely readable, even as a philosophy paper. So
that's a compliment. Thank you.
I recommend that people read it. I'll provide a link to the paper in the description of this. And then as far as forthcoming work, where can people kind of like follow you and what you're up to?
Yeah, I have a website that's just my name. I'm pretty Googleable for better and for worse. So my website is probably the best source of information. It's never fully up to date, but I will be updating it soon. And then I'm also on Twitter, again, under my name. It's pretty easy to find. I don't post much on there, though, so it's not a great source.
That's probably wise.
Yeah, I think so. So.
Yeah. Okay, well, stay on the call for a minute if you would, but I'll stop the recording. And again, thank you so much for doing this.
Of course, yeah.